Right, what on earth are we on? Episode 11. Episode 11. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody, to our Heaven series podcast, where we are exploring what heaven will be like and how our hope can be in heaven. And actually, from this podcast onwards, we're shifting our focus to asking maybe the all-important question, or the question many of us have had at some point: if heaven is real, how do I get there? And I'm joined by Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hi, really looking forward to this week. This is going to be a great set of podcasts thinking about this whole question of, how do I get to heaven? Is it just about being good? Is it about something working hard? What's it going to be about? So I can't wait to unpack these few days.
Yeah, what do you think people's most common response to that question would be if you went out on the streets of Andover and said, "How do you get to heaven?" What do you think people would say?
I think it's the good thing. I think
Yeah.
it's about being a good person.
Yeah.
And Becky, you know, these podcasts have been going along with the Sunday sermon series that we've been doing. And in the sermon I've done on this subject that links in with this, that's a key question that I've tried to answer, and that is, how good is good enough? If getting to heaven is about being good, then who is the arbiter of what's good and what's not, and whether I've been good enough or not good enough? So for me, I think if people are thinking about heaven, I think there's a lot of people who aren't thinking about that, or I think there's a lot of people who talk, we talked about this before, and our culture talk about heaven a lot, but not really put a lot of thought into it. So I think if you ask people who weren't apathetic about this question, who genuinely kind of thought, I think there is a heaven, and you said, well, okay, how are you going to get there? How does anybody get there? I think most people would talk about, in some way, shape, or form, it's about being good. It's about what we do. It's about how we've treated people or whatever. Does that make sense? Do you think? Would you agree with
Yeah,
that? Do you think that's the big thing? Yeah.
Yeah, it
Okay.
seems to be the most common response, isn't it? So, yeah, we're going to unpack this question and see if there's a bit more to it than that, or whether that's even right. Is it even
Yes.
right that
Yeah. I'm
getting to
looking
heaven
forward to
means
it.
being good?
And we are looking at one of my favorite stories from the life of
Really?
Jesus actually today, because it's one I've talked about a lot in church leadership stuff that I've been involved in, because I think for Christians, actually, this story gives us some marching orders about what we're supposed to be prioritizing. And I think for churches, it gives us some marching orders about what churches are supposed to be thinking about, and what our primary purpose is, and what maybe our mission is, and that kind of stuff. So I'm really glad that you picked this story for today to launch us into this week. And I think it's hard for us to understate how profound an encounter this was in the culture and context of Jesus's day, and how shocking it was the way Jesus behaves in this story. So have we teased it
Wow, I'm
enough, do you
intrigued.
think?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued.
Okay, so you're going to read it for us
Yeah.
from Luke chapter 19. So Luke's account of the life of Jesus.
Yes. Okay. So, Jesus has he's received quite a warm welcome so far in the story leading up to this. A lot of crowds are gathering round to hear more about him and to hear some of his teaching. And Jesus has been performing miracles as well. So a lot of people are beginning to really kind of press in around him to try and reach out, touch him, ask him for a healing, ask him for prayer. And we're about to dive into this story where Jesus finds himself yet again in entering a new place and surrounded by many crowds, and an interaction that he has with somebody as that happens. So this is Luke 19. And it says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was very wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, He's gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've ever cheated anybody out of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Wow.
Yeah, great story. I love this.
So shall we unpack some of the things that are going on there in that story, Chris?
Yeah. So again, we're going to ask ourselves the same sorts of questions that we've been asking all the way through, starting with what's the context of this? Well, you've set the scene for us, Becky, already. Lots of crowds of people, all that kind of stuff. We've got a short tax collector, we're told here. So he can't see over the tops of the crowds. He was a chief tax collector, which meant
Mm.
he wasn't just a tax collector, he was the chief. And I guess tax collecting in these days was a little bit like a Ponzi scheme, right? So everybody gave money to everybody else up the chain until you got to the chief tax. So tax collectors were allowed to collect more than the Roman authorities wanted in tax, so they could keep. That's how they kind of paid
Mm.
themselves. And then the tax collectors, the underling tax collectors, would pay a bit to the people above them, and so on and so forth. And you got to the chief tax collector. Here's somebody who's very wealthy, but has all his wealth really has been generated off the backs of people who are working and not just paying the taxes that the Romans are requiring, but
Mm.
paying Zacchaeus and his crew of tax collectors what they think they should get. So Zacchaeus would have been resented for that hugely. Not only was he working for the authorities who were persecuting or had taken over the land. So they would have been, the authorities would have been resented, the Roman authorities. He's not only working for them, but he's also then taking a lot of money off of people. So he would have been hated, really, in his community. I always think this brings a smile to my face. If 2,000 years after this has taken place, we're reading this, of all the people who could have been remembered in Jericho that day, Zacchaeus is the one that still gets talked about 2,000 years later. If you'd said that to the people in Jericho, they would have been absolutely horrified
Yeah.
that Zacchaeus was still the one we were talking about. So, and then this amazing encounter happens where, of all the people Jesus could have picked, he picks Zacchaeus to have a conversation
Yeah.
with.
Yeah.
And that's
Really the
interesting.
last person he should have picked out of that crowd,
Yeah,
right? Not
absolutely.
only because of his job, but also because he's tiny.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is interesting about this is we talked about this. Was it? I can't remember which day it was, but we talked about that encounter Jesus had with a rich young ruler, which happens just before this. And again, there's just an interesting contrast here that's painted for us. The rich young ruler goes away sad because he can't do what Jesus is asking him to do, or he doesn't feel he can. And yet he's a righteous man. We're told that if people remember the story, that rich young ruler, righteous, he's living by all the right religious laws and all that kind of
Mm.
stuff, but his heart is not in the right place. His heart is given over to money and material wealth and all that kind of stuff. So then we have this encounter with Zacchaeus, and we get this contrast that Zacchaeus is not a righteous figure at all, and yet he has this heart transformation as a result of meeting Jesus, which he says, okay, I've now seen there's something way more important than my money, so I'm prepared to give a whole load of it away, and all of that kind of stuff, pay everybody back because of this encounter I've had with Jesus. So that seems it's a great contrast, I think, in those two stories.
And then Jesus gives this kind of wrap up to what's happened. He says, "Today salvation has
Mm.
come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So, shall we just walk through what Jesus is saying there?
I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
So, today salvation has come to this house. How do you interpret that,
Yep.
Chris?
Salvation is a word we often use, I guess, around Christian kind of circles. Rescue, you
Mm.
might say. So I guess probably whether we're a person of faith or not, I suspect, would all acknowledge that there are some things we need rescuing from, some of the choices that we make, or the things that we don't do that we should, all of that sort of stuff. And Jesus offers rescue, offers salvation, offers to save us from ourselves, from the stuff that we do that would separate us from God, that kind of stuff. And that's the same thing that's happening here. So today, rescue, salvation, setting somebody on a new path, all of that has come to Zacchaeus.
Yeah. And then Jesus says, "This man too is a son of Abraham." So,
Mm.
by that, he's saying he's a son, a child of the promise. And the Abraham was kind of the person that the Jewish faith begins with. He is the person that God comes to and establishes this promise with in the Old Testament part of the Bible. that he will build a people out of Abraham's descendants, and that they will be chosen by God, and they will be God will establish a covenant with them. And a covenant is like a binding promise that means that God will always be their God. He'll always protect them. He will always be on their side. And Jewish people would think of themselves as children of Abraham, children of that promise. And Jesus is affirming to Zacchaeus, who had in his previous life turned his back on his people by becoming a tax collector, by working for the enemy. Jesus says, no, this man is a son of Abraham. I'm counting him as part of
Yeah.
all that God has promised to people.
And I think that's one of the big shocks in how Jesus treats Zacchaeus. Of all the, again, I think perhaps we don't want to miss the significance of that language that Jesus chooses to use there. Because he could have said, today salvation has come to this house because I've rescued this guy, or because his life is now on a new path. But he chooses this, I think, quite provocative language there to say, particularly to people of the Jewish faith who would have been all over the place in Jericho and in that crowd and all that kind of stuff. He is one of you. Because of the rescue that I'm offering, he is now a son of Abraham. He is a child of God in the way they would have all considered themselves children of God. And again, I'm not sure I'm getting across the kind of what I'm trying to feeling inside about this, which is it was scandalous that Jesus would have, to all those other people, that this man Zacchaeus, who they would have considered to have been completely lost to the possibility of a relationship with God, is now. And I just think it's fascinating that Jesus would use that language.
Yeah. And there's that final phrase, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So, Son of Man, that's this title that Jesus would often use to refer to himself. And it's bringing language out of a book in the Old Testament again called Daniel, where there are visions of this King of God who would establish God's rule and reign in the world. And we've talked a bit about that in this podcast already. So that's the title Jesus would pull out of the Old Testament to help people to grasp who Jesus was and what he was doing. And then it says he came to seek and to save the lost. I know you're quite passionate about this final sentence here, Chris. Do you want to just unpack for us what Jesus is saying there?
Yeah, well, I think he's telling everybody who was there, this is why I'm here. We talked on day 10, so the last day of this podcast, we talked about purpose, living with purpose, living with the end in mind. Jesus is saying here, I think in no uncertain terms, this is my purpose. I am the Son of Man. That was a title he gave to himself, and I've come to seek and to save the lost. I've come for people like Zacchaeus, whose lives need turning round, who need a relationship with God, and all that. And I think again, if we were honest with ourselves, most of us would say, yeah, I'm lost sometimes. I get lost in my own selfishness, or I get lost in a lack of purpose, or I get lost in the things that I mess up, or I get lost in the hurt I sometimes cause other people, however unintentionally. I'm lost in different ways. And here Jesus say, yeah, you're exactly the kind of people that I've come. And I think Jesus is just saying, these are my marching orders. This is my purpose. And I think that's an extraordinary thing to have laid out that clearly that day to all of those people. And I think then, if we're followers of Jesus, it seems entirely logical to me that these would be our marching orders, to follow his example of doing all we can to seek and save the lost for the sake of Jesus. So, yeah, I do. I think it's a really, really important story, and that's a really important verse.
Yeah, and it's such an essential verse for any of us who maybe are still figuring out who Jesus is, or carry baggage from previous church experiences, previous introductions to Christianity that have told us that it's about being good, looking holy, and that those are the people that Jesus favors, and those are the people who Jesus is ready to receive. And you've got to clean your act up before you can access anything that Jesus has to offer. And this is at the heart of who Jesus is and his posture towards people, isn't it? That he
Yeah,
came to seek and to save those who are lost.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
we asked this question, what's the context? We've talked about that. And then we ask the question, what's the point? Why was this story recorded? Why are we still reading about Zacchaeus today? And what's the point of what Jesus was doing here as well?
Yeah.
Do you want to start with that,
Yeah,
Chris?
well, for me, there's a twofold thing here. Number one is for us, like personally, individually, if you feel lost, if you've ever felt lost, if you have ever felt that like God couldn't possibly love you, God couldn't possibly be for you, you're not worthy of that, you've messed up in your life. How could God possibly want me? Well, this story speaks into all of that, I think, because you know, Zacchaeus was the kind of the most lost of the lost, if you
Mm,
like, and the most potentially, by the world's eyes, the most unworthy person. And that's why it was so scandalous that of all the people in Jericho, Jesus goes to him. And that should tell us something about Jesus. It should tell us something about the Christian faith. And it should speak to us. I hope it speaks to us about our worth and value to God. So I think that's number one.
yeah,
That's the point. And number two, I think I've alluded to it already, so I won't say too much more about that. But if this was Jesus's purpose, then it should be the Jesus followers' purpose
yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah. I think to me the reason that Luke, the guy who wrote this, and Luke was a doctor, and he compiled he interviewed lots of eyewitnesses, it seems, in order to put together his account of Jesus's
Yeah.
life. And some people speculate about the different people he might have drawn his accounts from. Many people think that a lot of Luke's witnesses were women, in fact,
Right.
because there's a strong
Yeah.
emphasis on the stories of women in Luke's gospel, which is just a cool fact to throw in there.
Yeah.
But the reason I think that Luke structures the story in this way, and that he uh, told this story about Jesus, and the thing I think when I read this, he's emphasizing in how he portrays the story, is that Jesus offers an opportunity for us to turn round and start a new life from today. And there's a lot of emphasis in the way the story, he came down, Jesus comes up to the tree where Zacchaeus is hiding, and he says, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. Come down right now. I'm staying at your house today. And it talks about Zacchaeus coming down. And on that day, he says, do you know what? I'm going to turn my life around, and I'm going to go in a new direction from now. And I think that is, and Jesus wrapping it up with today,
Mm.
salvation has come to this house today. Not, okay, we're on the road towards salvation now. It's today salvation has come to this house. And to me, that emphasis it just speaks so much hope to me. It speaks so much hope to anybody, I think, that Jesus offers an opportunity for us to go in a new direction from this moment in
Yeah.
our lives.
That's really good. And that resonated actually when you were saying that. I was thinking, oh, and again, whichever day it was, I can't remember, but I think in the first few days of this podcast, we talked about Jesus' response to the criminal on the cross
Yeah.
next to him. Today, you will be with me in paradise. There's a kind of an urgency to that, isn't there? That yeah, today I hadn't thought about that, but that's great.
Yeah.
Mm.
And leading into that kind of what's the difference question that we're asking on this podcast, what difference does this make to our lives, to how we understand God, to how we think about heaven? I think what that means is that the difference that makes is we haven't got to earn our way
Mm.
back into God's good books, that we don't have to pay off a bad reputation in order to get on the road to heaven. And it kind of is insulting and flies in the face. And it would have been so jarring for the people watching that. Hang on, Jesus, don't you know all the things Zacchaeus has done? Are you really going to let him back into your good books today?
Yeah.
Like, fair enough, maybe in a couple of years where he's paid off all of his debts. But the fact that it's so instantaneous, that the minute Zacchaeus decides, yeah, I'm going to go a different route now, Jesus says, yeah, you're welcome with me.
Yeah.
I'm accepting you back right now.
Yes.
And the difference that makes to us and to how we approach Jesus. How many of us think that we've got to grovel our way
Mm.
towards Jesus,
Mm.
especially if we feel like we've done wrong in our
Yes.
lives, or we've been told that we're too wrong for
Yes.
Jesus or whatever.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
this passage makes absolutely explicit you've not got to earn your way back into God's good books. I mean,
Yes.
God
Yeah.
doesn't have good books, but
Yeah.
you haven't got to earn your way back into his favor.
Yes, yeah, and then I love too that there's this today, salvation's come,
Mm.
and today Zacchaeus's life starts changing.
Yeah.
So he's had this encounter with Jesus. Salvation has come, and his heart is changed, and it starts from that very outset. And for Zacchaeus, and this might not be true for everybody, for Zacchaeus, the heart change that Jesus is bringing into his life straight away is to do with this compassion, care for, giving back to other people. That's the kind of the transformation that immediately begins happening in Zacchaeus's life. But in other people's lives, it might be a different thing. It might be something else that begins that transformation. But again, that journey of transformation begins from that very day in the life of Zacchaeus, and an encounter with Jesus begins to transform our hearts. And I think that's very clear to see from this.
Yeah, and you get to start that journey with Jesus and go through that with him. I
Yeah.
remember seeing just a short clip online of a guy who was talking about this kind of idea about us feeling like we need to sort ourselves out before we come
Mm.
to Jesus, and actually the process of transformation we go on with him. And he was telling a story of somebody who had asked him at a conference, "Oh, I want to follow Jesus, but do I have to give up smoking pot before I follow Jesus?" And he'd said, he turned round back to him with a question. He said, "Well, do you get clean before you go in the shower?" He said, "No, of course not. Like, I go in the shower to get clean."
Yeah.
And he said, "It's the same with Jesus. Come to him and he'll help you get sorted out in the rest of your areas of
Yeah.
your life. You don't clean up your act before you come to the person who can rescue you."
Yeah, that's good, isn't it? And I think about those friends of Jesus, those disciples that we talk about, who became followers of Jesus, and many
Mm.
of them had that very dramatic kind of follow me encounter with Jesus. They started following of Jesus, but they had a lot to to work out, but that didn't stop them from being able to follow Jesus. And they messed up, and they denied even knowing him, and all of that sort of stuff. But that wasn't, they didn't have to get all that sorted before that Jesus said, "No, come on, follow me, and then we'll kind of figure
Yeah,
out the rest as we go
yeah,
on." And I think I love that idea.
yeah,
And I think we miss that sometimes.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So we've probably talked quite a lot about the difference that this makes, haven't we? So we then come on to the tweet. What's our
Yes,
tweet for today? Have you
yeah.
managed to summarize this
So
into a tweet, do you
I
think?
thought quite a lot about this one, and I think I've landed on one that I feel like gets to the heart of what excites me about this story. So here we go. See what you think, Chris. When it comes to getting to heaven, the one day you say yes to Jesus is worth more than 1,000 days saying no.
Mm. Say that again. I'm going to have to think about that.
When it comes to getting to heaven, the one day you say yes to Jesus is worth more than 1,000 days saying no.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that
I love
shows
that.
it's Zacchaeus' story. He's had who knows how
Yeah.
long he's been saying no to God's will and God's way for before the moment when Jesus arrives at his tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that the minute he says, "Okay, yeah, I'm in now. I'm following you." That's enough.
Yeah. 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 Great. And you could exactly the same true of that guy on the cross next to
Yes,
Jesus.
that's right.
How many days of his life that he said no to God and
Yeah,
acted in, he's not there by accident, right?
yeah,
He's acted in ways that have led down that road for
yeah,
him. But in that one moment on the cross, he recognizes Jesus,
yeah,
and Jesus says, "Yep, you're in."
yeah,
Love that.
yeah.
Yeah, great. I'm not going to add to that. I think that's brilliant. So I'm
Okay,
I'm I'm in for that tweet.
cool. So what about the what's next then? What's
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to keep coming back to, if it's okay, I'm going to keep coming back to the two key things I think are going on in this story. So, number one, if you have had thousands of days of saying no, don't let that stop you. And even today being the day where you might say yes to Jesus. So, he came to seek and to save the lost. That's you and that's me. And that may be people listening to this today who are feeling that way and have maybe either consciously or subconsciously said no to Jesus for a long time. And today's the day to say yes, and to understand that he's not expecting anything, he's not requiring anything of you. Just to say yes is the beginning of that journey. So for me, that's number one. Number two, if you're a person of faith, if you're part of Andover Baptist Church, if you're part of your local church, then the challenge to us, I think, is if this was Jesus's mission, it should be our mission. What are we going to do today to be the hands and feet of Jesus in our world today, to reach out with God's love so that those who are lost might be given the opportunity to say yes to Jesus?
Yeah. Yeah. And a huge part of that is that people don't feel they need to earn their place with us.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's one big thing that really sticks with me from looking at the way Jesus interacts with Zacchaeus in this, is if I'm going to follow Jesus and be like that, then I shouldn't set myself up so that anybody has to earn their place into being good with me, being okay with me, and me welcoming them.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Introducing people to Jesus and then worrying about the rest later
Yeah.
seems to me to be a really good way to live in church life.
Brilliant. I'm inspired.
Great, love that story. Thank you for leading us into that one today. It's been brilliant, and I hope it's been helpful and inspiring to everybody who's been listening to us today.
Absolutely. And we'd catch up with you in the next episode of this podcast.
Can't wait.
Yeah. See you soon.
So I did notice one thing there. I hope that's so. When you were about to read the passage, you said Matthew 19.
Oh, did I?
Yes. So I don't know whether you can just edit that or do
Hang
something.
on. Luke 19.